the Lord as it comes to us from Exodus chapter 7, verses 1 through 17. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. This is today's. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it do all your work. Or on it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and mother so that you may live long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder or commit adultery or steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant or ox or donkey or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Today we're going to talk about the fourth commandment. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. So that's the goal today. And in order to get us going, this just happened to me this morning on my way to work. For me, I don't know if you know this, I work on Sundays. And so I have a very complicated relationship with the Sabbath because unlike most of you, you didn't wake up at 5 this morning to start thinking about, what you're going to do and getting everything ready. So my whole day started early. And I was a little late getting out of the house this morning because I've got this thing called children, and they always ruin my schedule. And I'm late, running out of the house, trying to get there. And I get to the 12th Street in Brickell, right over here. And what ends up happening is they're shooting a commercial somewhere on Brickell. And so there's just cops blocking every lane. And I can't get here. And I'm like, man, I've got to do things. I've got to prep for this morning. I've got to turn on the coffee machines. I've got to talk to anyway, whatever. All these things are going through my head. And I'm thinking to myself, how come they're working on Sunday? Don't they know I have to get to work, And I'm like, all right. Sabbath day. Take a deep breath, Chris. All right. That's funny. I just had a little Sabbath moment right before this. When it comes to the Sabbath, we all have tons of questions that are super practical, starting with, do we still have to follow this commandment? And how does it work? I wrote down some other questions that maybe you've asked before, or maybe you haven't, but maybe they trigger something in your mind. Can you take a Sabbath on Tuesdays? Have you ever thought about that question? Can you take a Sabbath on Tuesday instead of Sunday, and is that wrong? What does the Bible say about that? Would it be better if the United States had blue laws again? Does anyone remember blue laws? I know, I'm not calling you out on your age, Ted, but I'm guessing you were alive when that was a reality, right? So there was a time in the United States where on Sunday, after church, of course, on Sundays, you couldn't go to a movie, you couldn't buy alcohol. There were all kinds of laws that prohibited commerce on Sunday mornings not very long ago in the United States' history called blue laws. Would it be a good idea if we had those again or not is a good question. Does binge watching Netflix count as honoring the Sabbath because you're resting? Some of you are like, I Sabbath all the time. I watched all of Maniac yesterday, and I'm doing just fine. One time, this is a true story, I was hooked on the show 24 like a decade ago. I don't know if anyone even remembers that show 24. But one time I had an idea where I watched an entire season of 24 in 24 hours in real time with the show. Think about that. Each episode was 48 minutes, so I had 12 minutes either to make food or have a bathroom break. I was watching that show in real time. Is that honoring the Sabbath if I rested for a whole day and just watched TV? I don't know. Does going to the beach count as honoring the Sabbath because you're resting? Hey, I'm retired. Do I still need to work 6 days and then rest on one? Or can I reverse that and just rest for 6 and work sometimes? In American culture and other cultures, we have this idea that once you retire, you're done. And that's the goal that our life is supposed to have. And that when you finally reach that point, the whole idea of a Sabbath goes away and you can make every day a Sabbath. Our culture almost idolizes the idea of rest and says that if you can finally be rich enough and be healthy enough or whatever it is, then you can finally just have Sabbath all the time. Is that how it's supposed to be? What if I'm a parent and rest is an illusion? What if you're a parent and you never get a chance to rest? This summer I took vacation with my family, and we have our 2 little ones, a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, not quite one, just 6 months actually. Actually, no, he was 3 months when we started that project. And I'm on vacation with my little ones, and I'm not lying. I would have rather, if I wanted rest, I would have been at work every day than on vacation with my children. So is rest, how do you even do that as a parent? What does that look like, I think is an interesting question. Didn't Jesus get rid of the Sabbath? Some of you might be asking. Do we still have to do this? It didn't seem to be like a major command in the New Testament where people are supposed to honor it. Does the Sabbath really mean go to church, or does it mean resting? Are those the same things, and how does that work? What if I go to church on Saturday nights? Is that a Sabbath? How does that work? Do I need to quit my job if it forces me to work on Sundays? That's a question people have had in the past. My kid plays soccer on Sundays. What do I do? These are all just practical questions, right? Maybe you've thought about some of these questions in the past, but when it comes to the 4th commandment and the Sabbath and our lives, it's often very challenging to figure out how those connect. What does Sabbath mean, and how does that work into my life? So today what we're going to do is just talk about these things for a little minute. Hopefully we can gain some clarity. We're going to use the framework that we've used for each commandment, talking about how each one has a vision, each one has a guardrail, and each one has a mirror to show us who we really are. So that's the rubric by which we're going to talk about these commandments today. But let's start with the idea of a vision. Each commandment isn't just a rule. I hate rules. But each commandment actually behind the rule has a vision for how the world's supposed to be. So don't take the Lord's name in vain has an idea of how we're supposed to talk about God and how that's supposed to be a beautiful thing. Well, when it comes to the Sabbath, honoring the Sabbath and keeping it holy, what's the vision behind that, and how is that supposed to work? I think that's a good question. Well, here's what's kind of crazy. When God made the world, if you know the story from Genesis chapter 1 or Genesis chapter 2, this is how it worked, is he got busy on day 1 and he started making stuff, and he did it on day 2, and he kept working and working and working all the way through day 6. And then on day 7, what does God do? He rests. And that's a funny idea, right, that God would rest. Was God tired? Was God exhausted? Was God saying, man, I've been working so hard, I need to take a deep breath because God is tired right now? No, God doesn't get tired. And so why would God rest on a 7th day, I think is an important question to ask, because it can't be just because we're exhausted. Usually when we think of a Sabbath, we think of exhausting ourselves all week, finally getting there, and then recovering like after a good workout, where you jump in your like cold tank and get your muscles all working again. God wasn't tired. And yet he still took a Sabbath. Why? Well, the idea is that God wanted to enjoy the creation that he'd made. He wanted to take time away from the work side of it, which we'll talk about in a second. He wanted to take time away from that to just sit back and say, you know what? If I'm working all the time, I never have the time to enjoy what I've made. And life can be like that, right? Where we're so busy all the time, though we often don't get the chance to enjoy it. I've lived in Miami now for 8 years, and I can count on like barely 2 hands like how many times I've been to the beach. It's so easy to be in the midst of a creative, chaotic life that you forget that God sometimes calls you to stop and enjoy the things that are all around you. Here's something I like to do sometimes that helps reframe me and restructure how I think. Is I look at the world and it's one way, but then I think about what heaven would be like. And that my job as a pastor or as any Christian or Christ follower is to try and make heaven on earth as it is in the Lord's Prayer. Do we work in heaven? Do you think when we get to heaven we'll have work to do? If Genesis 1, which is before the fall, is the way that God structured and ordered creation and how it's supposed to be, then even when we get to heaven, we'll work for 6 days and rest for 1. And that's a crazy idea to us. Because when I think of work, and many of you think of work, we think of drudge and terror and boring and horrible bosses and not getting paid enough and doing things we don't like. But if work were the way it should be, and of course we work in a broken world. In heaven, what we do is we spend time gardening. We spend time painting. We spend time sharing. We spend time maybe even writing computer code that blesses other people and makes things really efficient. What we do is we start using all of our gifts and all of our talents and all of our passions in a way that's truly for other people and full of passion to do something that's beautiful and good. So it's a crazy idea to think about. When we think of work right now, we think of just having to put on a suit maybe, or put on clothes and go teach those second graders that are miserable and killing you every day. I'm just teasing. Maybe that's happening. But whatever it is, we often have a disconnect between the reality of work in this world and the way that it should be. God designed us to work. God loves working. That's what he did on days 1 through 6. He loves the idea of being creative, of being productive, of using your skills to be a blessing to other people. And so when I get to heaven, I picture myself doing all the things that I've ever dreamed of doing. I get to engage in the arts and maybe even be a part of that. Learn how to sing, learn how to dance. I don't even know. I mean, I moved to Miami and my hips still move the same way that they used to before I came here. But I'm hoping in heaven I learn how to start doing stuff. So the idea in heaven is that we work in such a way that's beautiful and good. But we also rest. We take that time to spend and enjoy and sit back and reflect. There's a cool idea in Genesis 1 again that says, what's heaven like? Well, it's like a garden where you get to sit and enjoy it, and God walks around with you. The phrase it says is in the cool of the day. So it's like January in Miami, and you're just hanging out. That's what heaven is like on the Sabbath, where you just get to sit back from all the hard work and look at it in a new way and take perspective. I think that's a cool vision of the way that it's supposed to be. Now, the reality is in this world, our work is often tough and something we don't enjoy. We don't have time to take Sabbath or do anything like that. And so this is a challenge for us to think about how we could take the vision of work and play and apply that to today. So the second thing about this commandment is that it's a guardrail. It's something that helps us from going off the deep end. You know, I used this example before, but I'll use it one more time. You know, I've got a little girl, a 3-year-old girl, and we have all kinds of rules for her. And it's not because we love rules, they're to keep her safe. So we say, Grace, when the front door's open, don't run outside and play with the trucks that are driving on the street, right? Like, that could kill you. It's dangerous. And so we create a rule as a guardrail to keep her safe. When God said, honor the Sabbath and keep us holy, what guardrail do you think he was putting in place? Why would God, for our sake, make that rule? It's a good question to ask, I think. You know, one of the greatest challenges in our society is that we believe that the harder we work, the more blessed we will be. And often our productivity is increased to our effort, but not all the time. I heard some silly NPR thing one time where they were asking different politicians in D.C., they said, what's your life more like? And they took the two famous TV shows at the time about politics. One was House of Cards, where you've got one guy that's like this brilliant schemer trying to game the whole system and make everything work, who's a mastermind to make it all happen. And the other show they said, is politics more like that? Or is it more like the show Veep? Veep is a show where it's got the silliest, most idiotic characters in the history of the world, and every single moment is chaotic confusion and no one knows what's happening. And they said, what's Washington, D.C. more like? Is it like the mastermind or is it like stupid chaos? Guess which one they decided? It's definitely more like the stupid chaos thing. The truth is that we have very little control over the way the world works. We don't get to control where we're born or how everyone acts and decides in the world. And so there's a temptation that comes sometimes to us that says, hey, if I just work harder and do everything right and I'm smarter and work harder and try harder all the time, then maybe I can make the outcome of my life exactly the way that I want it to be. How often does that happen? Is it true that by working harder, we usually find peace? Is it true that by working 100% of the time, we usually find and achieve everything that we've wanted? Typically not. One of the reasons why God made this is to remind us that we are not 100% in control of our lives. There's a cool story in the Bible that has, this is right before the 10 Commandments. They're wandering in the desert. And of course, they get out in the desert and they're just freed from slavery. And they're like, Moses, you brought us out here to die. We need to eat. You got to give us some food. And so one of the things that God started to do is manna would rain down from heaven and this amazing bread and quail where they could have food that literally fell from the sky and it would be there every morning when they woke up. And so, of course, there was, when they saw that, they said, sweet, look at all this food all around us. What's the natural inclination when you see a bunch of free stuff on the ground? Grab as much as you can, right? And so what they would do is they would go out there and they would grab everything that they could find. It'd be like finding $20 bills all over the ground. So they go out there and they start grabbing everything that they can and pulling it in. And what God had told them, though, was that it's going to come every day, but here's the one caveat. This is the one trick to it. is every night at the end of the night, whatever they gathered that day will rot and spoil, and they're going to have to go out again the next day to collect new stuff. That seems like a really weird mind trick for God to play, right? Not very cool, but every day they would go out and gather it, and if they had anything left over at night, it would spoil or disappear, and then they had to go get new stuff the next day. What was God doing with that? He was teaching them that, they think that if they just go and gather a week's worth, then they're going to be fine for a whole week. What God was trying to teach them is, no, every single day I will provide for you. Every single day I will be there for you, and not just on one day, and you have to be scared the rest of the time. The world isn't a place where you have to work like that. I will provide for you every single day, and you don't have to stress out on Monday if you got enough for Thursday. The only exception that God made was on Saturday. They knew the Sabbath was coming. Well, I guess it would have been there Friday. But on Friday, they had to collect 2 days' worth because they weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath, and God allowed that. Here's what's unique about it. What God was trying to teach them was that the quality of your life and your security is not rooted in your productivity. The quality of your life and your security is not rooted in how hard you can work. Yesterday, I've been practicing or trying my best to practice a Sabbath on a weekly basis for a long time. And yesterday, there was a tough moment for me where I was like, in the middle of my Sabbath day, and it was my Sunday afternoon, and so I did a dorky thing. I like to make a puzzle sometimes, and the kids were napping. It was a wonderful moment for me. And there was this part in my brain, I could feel it starting to fire and wire like crazy. And what was happening in my mind was, Chris, you need to go work on that thing. You don't have very much time. What you need to do really right now as much as possible is go respond to your email, see if there's anything in it, get working on that project that's, so my brain was like, and then my heart rate started to elevate, and I could feel the pressure of needing to work hard was right there. And I also knew that if I kept resting, the work wasn't going to go away. In fact, one of the reasons why I often don't rest is because I know that if I do, my life's going to get worse. If I rest, and that just means the next day has twice as much to do. If I take today off, then what that means is the next day is going to be twice as bad. I might as well use this free time, my Sunday, to actually get stuff done so that I'm ahead by the time I get to Monday. At least that's a temptation I feel in my heart all the time. And with God and the manna story, one of the things I have to remind myself of is that my blessing, my joy, is not dependent on how hard I can cram work into every single moment of my life. And maybe you feel the same way, maybe you don't. For some of us, maybe resting's easy. For some of us, it isn't. I know for me, it's one of the biggest spiritual challenges that I have. In fact, in my own life, the idea of a Sabbath is one of the things that saved it. I was one of those people that always believed that if I could just outwork people and do a really good job and hustle, I was a hustler, right? I was like Alexander Hamilton back in the day. Trying my best to just work really hard, and Sunday was an extra day to get stuff done. What that ended up doing in my life, and maybe this has happened to you, was once you get into that mentality, you start to be thinking that the quality of your life is 100% in your hands and in your control. And is that really the way the world works? I also know that sometimes it leads to burnout, where you start thinking, okay, I just got to work harder, work harder, work harder. What ends up happening when you stop taking a Sabbath is you get into a place of burnout and exhaustion. And I've never met a person who makes wise decisions when they're tired. I've never met a person who's able to love other people freely when they're exhausted. Remember, Jesus said, love others as you love yourself. The idea of taking care of yourself and of resting and of being responsible and slowing down is one of the things that we're not typically trained to do. Our culture, our capitalist society, is in many ways designed to treat us like we're robots that are supposed to function at 100% all the time. There's a famous quote by Bill Gates. He was asked a long time ago whether or not he went to church, and he said, I don't really go to church. I don't find it an efficient use of my time. And it's interesting that the reason why he didn't go isn't because he didn't like church. He just viewed himself as a product that had to accomplish things, and that his value was determined by his efficiency. And don't get me wrong, I love Bill Gates. I'm a Seattle guy. But that really kind of encapsulates where our society is. Even on Sundays, our phones blow up. One of the hardest things that I did in the last year, and it took me a while to get used to it, is I turned off all notifications on my phone except for phone calls. And even then, I look at it and I'm like, that's not in my contacts. Nope, if you know what I mean. The reason why I did that is because I didn't want the pace of the world to determine the pace of my heart. I didn't want the pressures of society and the intensity of what drives the economic engine of the world to be the same thing that drives my head and my heart and how I'm trying to follow God. There's been real sacrifices to that. One of the things that it tests is, are you really willing to trust God that He'll provide for you even when you're saying, I'm not going to work for a little bit? That's a hard thing. I know people that have changed their jobs and their roles because of how demanding it was on their time, and they weren't even allowed to go to church for a while, and I know that that's a real struggle for some people. When my family was growing up, we were a soccer family, and so that question at the beginning was actually one for me. And so the way it works when you're really little is you start playing soccer on Saturdays, and then you start getting better at soccer, and you start playing a little bit more in the afternoons. And then if you keep playing sports and you're moderately okay at them, then you start playing on Saturdays and Sundays. And then you're like, well, maybe I can cram an afternoon service. But then you're traveling every other weekend for sports, and it never stops and starts accelerating, because then you add on a high school team and a second team, and your whole life becomes something else. I remember when I was a young kid, I was probably in 6th grade, there was one kid on our team whose parents said that if he had a game before noon on a Sunday, he couldn't play. I just remember, and we all looked at him like, what's wrong with that kid? He's actually really good. Why is he hurting our team by quitting right now? And that was kind of the approach that we all felt. He was confusing and weird, and we didn't understand what he was doing. His parents must have been crazy, wacko, conservative people that we didn't understand. I mean, that was kind of the mentality in my head I remember as a little kid, because I thought all those things, maybe that's just how I'm remembering it. But, I have those decisions to make now. What do I do with my little kids? And do I have any guardrails on their time? And do I put any guardrails and boundaries around the intensity and the pressures of the world that's put on them? Really difficult questions to answer. And just so you know, parents, those of you who are out there, this isn't the kind of church where we're going to tell you how to do it, because we're not exactly sure ourselves, but we do know we'll be with you and support you in the midst of that, because we know how challenging it can be. But one of the reasons why God gave us this commandment was because He knew that the world would demand more of us than it could provide. And the promises that it makes, if you work harder, you'll get what you want, is something that's just not true. Many people that have more than we could ever imagine didn't work for it or earn it. And it's funny how the world works. But I'll end with this. This is a mirror. Because one of the things that happens with this commandment, take a break once a week. Spend time with God, get some rest. One of the things that it does is it exposes in our heart, it's a mirror to us. It exposes in our heart really what we want. So when I ask you, if you had 1 extra hour a day, how would you spend it? John walked right by me and he just goes, sleep. That's what he would really want. And that maybe shows that his whole life rhythm is out of order, and that's okay, especially because I know he's got a little one, and that can be chaotic and a difficult time. And he's also an employee of the church, and so I said, don't sleep. You got to work harder. No, right? I mean, even as a church, one of the things we work hard at is being the kind of employer to our employees that focus on this and make sure that people live a balanced, healthy life in the midst of doing work. It's a challenge that we face on a regular basis. But I know for me personally, when it comes to the Sabbath, at the end of the day, it asks me 2 questions. Do I really trust that God will provide for me, even when I say no to being productive? And am I willing to take some time away and spend it with God? I've got my Bible and my devotional that's always sitting on a coffee table that almost every single day I go and read in the morning when I wake up. And it's kind of just a routine and a rhythm. But I know there's some mornings where I wake up maybe 15 minutes late, and my to-do list is as long as it could possibly be, and I'm feeling the stress of my day already hitting me before my first steps are on the ground. And I remember just this last week, I look over at the Bible, and I look at my to-do list, and I look at my Bible, and I look at my to-do list, and I feel this internal pressure, like, what are my priorities? Where is my heart really at? There's a midweek men's Bible study that I go to on Thursday mornings at 7 a.m. And there's some mornings where I'm like, what do I really prioritize? It's a hard decision sometimes. Because whenever God says, take some time for me, what He's really doing is saying, hey, I know you've got time, but is it important to you? Is it important to you? I'll end with this story. So Jesus broke all the rules pretty much. He was crazy about that. And this is a story from Matthew chapter 12 that maybe you've heard before. It goes like this. So at that time, or one day, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. So he's walking through these grain fields, and it's like October maybe, so they're up high. And it says this, that his disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. This is on the Sabbath. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And apparently in Jewish tradition, it was against the rules to work on the Sabbath. And they had all kinds of specific rules that you couldn't break. So apparently like grabbing the grain and eating it was breaking one of their rules. I've told this story before, but it blows my mind. For the first 6 or 7 years that I was here at this church, for some reason it's not here now, almost once a month, there would be these Jewish, very, very traditional Jewish rabbis who would come. And what they would do is, because we're the only place in the city of Miami that doesn't have a bay walk, like cement along the bay, we actually have open waterfront. Apparently it would have been breaking the Sabbath command of Jews if they had walked past our property on the Sabbath. It would have made them unclean. And so what they would do once a month is they would show up with fishing line and ladders, and they would start in the corner of the property over there, and they would run a piece of fishing wire all the way around our property, and they came with like an official paper from the city that they could do this. And they would run fishing wire around our property, bless the fishing wire, and that way any Jew who walked past our property on Brickell on a Saturday wasn't breaking the Sabbath, because now it wasn't considered open waterfront. I don't get where all these rules come from. But it's funny to understand the difference between looking at a rule in a very legalistic way and looking at a rule the way Jesus did. Because look at where he takes this. So the Pharisees said, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." And Jesus answered, "Hey, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests." In other words, Jesus knows the rules better than they do. He already knows the exception. Then he goes, "Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent?" i.e., the rules aren't as hard, black and white as you may think. "I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would have not condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." Here's what Jesus is getting at, and it's going to get more interesting in a second. Here's what he's doing. He's saying, all right, anytime I give you a rule, this is like God talking to us. Anytime I give you a rule, don't get caught up in the rule. It's not about the rule. The only reason why I give you the idea of a Sabbath is so that you can have joy, is so that people can have blessing. If the rule, for some reason, is hurting you or not making you happy or not blessing you in a certain way, then the rule should be broken. That's a crazy idea coming from Jesus, but that's where he's going with this. He says, going from that place, he went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there, someone with leprosy maybe. And looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus, they asked him, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" So you can tell Jesus and the Pharisees are fighting against one another about what the Sabbath means and how you should operate on it. And he said to them, Jesus said, "If any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, would you not get it out? How much more valuable is a person than sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then he said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and Jesus completely restored it, just like the other. And then the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. This is a real story. See, those were people that took a Sabbath and worked at it really hard and had a million rules around it, and yet it was killing them. Their hearts were cold and mean, so much so that they were more concerned about keeping them the rule than they were about healing a person who was broken. So as Christians, we don't get all stuck up about the Sabbath, and we don't talk about it very much honestly, because we're not sure how to deal with it when it comes to Jesus. I mean, he basically just says, hey, do whatever you want on the Sabbath as long as it's good. But I'll leave you with this thought. Do you find enough time for rest so that you can properly enjoy the life God made for you? Or are you just running around frenetic and tired all the time? Because if you are, this commandment would be good for you. It would be very good for you. And the second thing I'll leave you with is this. There are many people I know that I've met that believe that if they just can work harder, they'll find peace. If they just had one more hour, then everything would be okay. If they could just get a little more time, everything would be fine. But what if everything you needed was available right now? What if everything you needed for joy and peace in your life was available by right now just taking a rest break and saying, God, thank you for what you've done? The primary point of the Christian faith is that we are not saved by what we do. We are not saved by how hard we work or by what we do in those first 6 days to get everything ready so that God will like it on the seventh day. The idea is, in the Christian faith, that we start with this idea of rest. When we started our service today, we didn't start by saying, God, we've done all these things right, and therefore we deserve to take communion in a minute, because we got it all together. Instead, the way the church works is we say, God, we're tired. We've been working so hard, and it's never been good enough. And every time I do my best, it's never good enough for me or for anyone else, maybe not even for you. Do I have any hope? And God says, come to me, all you who are heavy burdened and tired, and I will give you rest. Jesus didn't come to us to make us exhausted. He died on a cross so that we could be set free. And we've taken our freedom and turned it into another stress-filled life. If you are exhausted and stressed as a Christian, you truly do not understand the rest that God gives us. It's one of the best gifts that he ever made. And if you're an exhausted person, the Sabbath is an invitation to a life filled with peace. Will you pray with me? Lord, you are the Lord of this day. You're the Lord of every day. And we ask that our crazy hearts would be calm. We pray that you would give us your peace. Help us to get recentered on a rhythm of life that's sustainable and in sync with the creation that you made. We pray all of these things in the powerful name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and all God's people said, amen.